This is Amy Poehler. My new movie, Disney and Pixar's Inside Out 2, is coming to theaters June 14th, and it's making me feel joy and sadness and anger, definitely some disgust, and I think a little fear. But I'm also feeling these new emotions like anxiety, embarrassment, envy, and ennui.
It's what you call the boredom.
Okay, that one was weird. It's gonna be the feel everything movie of the summer. Disney and Pixar's Inside Out 2. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. Only in theaters June 14th. Get tickets now.
Hello, and welcome to Outward, Slate's podcast for all the delectable, sensuous morsels out there this Pride Month. I am your host, Jules Gill-Peterson, and I'm talking about food, of course. I think that was very unambiguous. But this is one of those Outward episodes that you might enjoy a little extra if you tend to listen maybe while you're cooking lunch or dinner, or maybe you should press pause just for a second to go get yourself a snack because you're in for a gastronomic treat. And I think you might not want to miss out on the experience of like eating along to the episode, if I could say that. I know this is an audio medium and it still can't deliver despite the promises made to me on cartoons as a child of some kind of smell-o-vision television or, taste along podcast format. But speaking of which, I have a little food backstory I wanted to share before I tell you about today's interview. I grew up in the Canadian suburbs, surrounded by other immigrant families, mostly from South and East Asia. And I spent a lot of my childhood watching TV, kind of just to dream about what the future might be like beyond what I knew. But I also loved to cook, and I also needed to help my mom take care of our family. So I started cooking dinners for all of us around age 10. And for years, I actually really wanted to be a chef when I grew up. But my culinary education, if I had one, came from turn of the millennium Food Network, which we'll get into a little bit more on this episode, because I don't know if any other listeners share this nostalgia for what to me now feels like the golden age of that channel before everything became a competition and reality series. But it's like my deeply gay self, and I'm sure I'm not alone, read Ina Garten and the Barefoot Contessa as camp when that show was premiering. I learned a lot about the power of women's sexuality from Nigella Lawson's extremely seductive dinner parties. And I first detected how French culinary imperialism had shaped the globe watching dubbed episodes of the original Japanese series Iron Chef, which is something that I actually get into in this episode with our guest, because I didn't go into the industry, and whatever has become of the Food Network, the food scene also looks interestingly different today than it did 20 years ago. So I'm really excited to sit down today with Chala June, self-described culinary storyteller, who's really one of the forces behind the phrase queer food that I'm sure you've probably been reading about or seen on social media, especially in the past year or so. So when we come back from the break, I'll sit down with Chala to get into all that good news. So go grab yourself something delicious to nibble on, and we'll be right back.
The Human Rights Campaign envisions a world where every member of the LGBTQ+ family has the freedom to live their truth without fear and with equality under the law. Pride is a joyful celebration of all the beautiful identities of our LGBTQ+ community. We create spaces where we can bring our whole selves to dance and march in the streets and declare, we are here, we are visible, we are proud. But this year, the HRC cannot ignore the mounting attacks against the LGBTQ+ community. This year, our rights and our lives will be on the line as anti-LGBTQ+ politicians and judges are up for election. And across the country, anti-LGBTQ+ legislators are taking their marching orders from extremist groups and are determined to tell their LGBTQ+ constituents that they should not be seen, heard, or even exist. This Pride Month, let's fight back against all the hate and celebrate this community. Equality for all, without exception. Donate today by visiting hrc.org/givepride. Make a generous gift this Pride Month and support the LGBTQ+ community.
Having choices is good, and checking accounts are no exception. At Sandy Spring Bank, we have a variety of checking options and make it easy to choose based on your needs. mobile deposits and payments, interest checking, or checking with no fees or minimums. Best of all, we'll help you select the account that suits your life. What's your next financial destination? Sandy Spring Bank. Visit sandyspringbank.com/checking. Member FDIC.
Everyone has a white whale. The one that got away. This is mine. It's December 7th, 2014. Around 1 a.m. The night of the attack.
There's gas. So is there like a gas leak or is there... We don't know what the fuck it is. We got people vomiting blood.
Rosemont police say an intentional chlorine gas leak has sent 19 people to the hospital.
You're telling me that there was a terrorist attack in 2014 involving the use of chemical weapons, but nobody heard about it?
This could not have been an accident.
People were eager to assume that it was some sort of hate attack.
I've gone through all the theories. I think there's only one that fits.
Yeah, you have to read this story.
Fear and Loathing. Out now wherever you get your podcasts.
Listeners, I have a feeling that, like me, you've probably seen the phrase queer food kind of out in the proverbial ether lately. Maybe you've read some of Bon Appetit's Food is Queer series that ran during June last year. Or maybe you read that long-form piece a couple of weeks ago about a queer food conference held at Boston University. Or maybe you've seen the word pop into conversations about much longer struggles around food scarcity, poverty, and racial justice, whether we're talking about food deserts or even the legalization of cannabis. Well, in each of those arenas, Chala June has been a signal voice. Chala is a Congolese-American genderqueer culinary storyteller and a cultural artist based in Brooklyn. After spending time in basically, it seems like every part of the food industry, whether as a line cook, a barista, a prep baker, a cheesemonger, one of my personal faves, they now develop recipes, host community dinners, and write about food, travel, and cannabis, another one of my faves, for outlets ranging from Bon Appetit, Them, Condé Nast Traveler, Culture Cheese Magazine, Cherry Bomb Magazine, and Edible Manhattan. And I'll say, as someone who gets a not inconsiderable degree of pleasure in life from both cooking and eating, but who's also really interested in the class and race politics of food, I really can't think of a better guide to digging into all the twists and turns of this up-and-coming phrase, queer food. So, Chala June, welcome to Outward, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to get into this rich, meaty topic.
Honestly, the metaphors have been coming in a little too fast and furious for me today, maybe because I was polishing things after eating breakfast, but I hope it's not too trite of a place to start. But could you tell us a little bit about how you got into this line of work in general, which is to say food, because rumor has it, some of it started at a food truck selling banh mi in Harvard Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But what's your kind of origin story?
The banh mi truck is definitely a crucial pivot point, but it actually starts, I want to say, in the year 1999, when I first watched an episode of Iron Chef on the Food Network. And I remember so vividly, it was the TV in my parents' bedroom. They were we were all winding down for sleep, but I was just in their room. My mom was flipping through channels and she lands on Food Network. And I'm just seeing these, and it was before they had the American version of Iron Chef. It was the Japanese dubbed version. And there are these chefs running around with the giant fish. And he's like, I got to get it to my station before time is up. And there's fire and knives and action and drama. And that was the first time I really saw that food was so much more than just the rotisserie chicken and rice and peas that we were eating at our dinner table. Food was this whole world, this whole culture, and this whole conversation around and about the world that we live in. And so that was that first moment where I was like, okay, there are things that I need to see and know and learn here. And so that passion for food, I became a Food Network obsessive as a child. Emeril Lagasse, Unwrapped with Mark Summers, Good Eats with Alton Brown. Those defined my childhood, truly. I was a nerd. I was completely obsessed. And as a kid, I wanted to work in food. I wanted to be a chef and open a restaurant, but also my dad is a Congolese immigrant, and that wasn't really the game plan. So as I was pursuing my degree in publishing, I was also thinking about what kind of publications I wanted to write for once I graduated, what kind of writing I wanted to do, and food kept really coming back into the picture and coming back just into my heart. And I think it was specifically watching one of the earlier seasons of Chef's Table when it was like still shiny and new that just like completely blew my mind open. And I had what I like to call a loving breakdown, which was me sobbing, thinking about the fact that writing is something that I'm really good at and talented at and skilled at, but food is my deepest passion and always has been and really always will be. And so I felt the need to start really honoring that part of myself. So I started working on a food truck, and I worked on a banh mi truck, slinging banh mi sandwiches for like a year and a half. And from there, I started seeking out line cook positions, seeking out other positions in the world of food.
Just for the record, people won't be able to see how aggressively enthusiastic my body language was when you're talking, because I was also a Food Network kid, and Iron Chef, the original Japanese version dubbed in English, was like totally an awakening for me too. I think very similar, that kind of moment of like, hold on, this is very exciting. I love how you were talking about kind of this transformation from maybe that era even of food consumer culture, and then this era that we're living in now, where food journalism, even food production in terms of TV has really changed, and kind of like, I don't know, there seems like a growing intimacy between those industries, which I find really interesting. But before I ask you about that, I kind of want to ask, how did the word queer enter into your food vocabulary, right? Like, this has been on my mind too, as I've been seeing even the phrase queer food thrown around, and I've seen the word queer put before everything, so it's not that particularly stands out to me, but I'm just curious, like, how did that start showing up for you?
Queer started showing up in my food vocabulary very intentionally, I want to say, in probably around 2020. I had already, been in the food world. I've been so passionate about just the different layers and scopes through which food really can be explored. And I, as a queer person, I was like, oh, well, I'm just making food and I am queer, but I didn't necessarily think to put the two together until 2020, when I started working with the then brand new Queer Food Foundation. It was founded by this really incredible person, Gabrielle Lenart, who was also building out the organization at the tail end of her work in the NYU food studies program. So she was in that graduate program and started really seeing the need for dedicated queer spaces in the food world, and just intention around how queer people gather around food, make food, and also intention around highlighting the queer people who are in the culinary industry. And that's something that spoke so deeply to me, because I'd worked in a bunch of restaurants. I worked in, all of these spheres in food, but was often one of the only queer people, definitely one of the only trans people. And I thought that just had to be the experience. I just thought that that's always what it was going to be. And so being brought into the fold to start working with this incredible organization that's still going, that's still really running strong, that has so many incredible chefs really behind it now, was my introduction into really the lens of like big Q, big F queer food, and viewing it as not just, okay, we have a bunch of gay people who like to cook, but really viewing it as a community that had specific needs that needed to be attended to, and a community that had specific stories and points of view that needed to be platformed and shared.
We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll continue this conversation with Chala June.
Hi, Outward listeners. It's Christina. Did you miss me? As you all know, I've been working on the 9th season of Slate's award-winning podcast, Slow Burn. It's called Gays Against Briggs. I can't wait to be back in your Outward feed soon. But in the meantime, I want to tell you about a very special event I'm doing with the Slow Burn team at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York City on June 13th. To celebrate the new season and Pride Month, Slow Burn is hosting an exclusive live taping of the show with special guests including Eric Marcus, the host of Making Gay History. We'll dive deeper into this season and talk about the lasting impact of the Briggs Initiative and the continued fight over LGBTQ rights in schools. Plus, we'll share some behind-the-scenes stories and never-before-aired tape from this season. It's going to be a really fun and meaningful way to celebrate Pride Month. Again, that's June 13th at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York City. You can get tickets now at tribecafilm.com/slowburn. Hope to see you there.
And we are back. I really, want to ask more about this kind of from the perspective of work, like labor. This seems really important to me. It's like the food industry, certainly in restaurants, like in the kitchen, but actually not only there is this sector, one of many, but one that's been really overhauled by the rise of gig work, or just like, I'm sure many can relate to that IRS form 1099 freelancer thing that ruins your taxes every April. So like this is like a sector though, right, where now we're seeing some convergences. You've got that kind of freelancing world, but also like you've got freelancing journalists. You've got this sort of broader precarious, like highly educated, but underpaid creative class. And that's there. But part of what seems really interesting too is that is now interfacing with and sitting alongside a very long history of racialized work, especially like undocumented labor in kitchens. And like this is the window, it seems like, in which like queer and trans people have like, I don't know who the tastemakers here are, but like, okay, you've got your shot. Maybe you can, not just be the only one in the room, but you have a shot at doing something. And, you've talked in some other interviews you've done, I think really eloquently about some of the pressures or just some of the challenges of kind of having to, sort of entrepreneurialize yourself a little bit in that environment. But like, I'm sort of curious from like a work perspective. I mean, what's your sense of like this moment?
I feel like there's definitely this weird juxtaposition that exists between greater queer representation in the industry and more queer outward presence. People are able to be out and loud and proud more in the food industry. And that representation does not always equate more protections. It doesn't necessarily equate more rights. It doesn't necessarily equate greater pay or equate more respectful opportunities, where there may be more restaurants that are willing to hire queer and trans people. They may still fall into the same old. Almost every single trans person I know has worked a food service job, like almost every single one. Like statistically speaking, we're all up there. And almost every single trans person I know has been let go from a food service job. And under that, it's often the unspoken, you're bringing too much of yourself to this environment, and that's not gelling with our ideal of what this restaurant is supposed to be. A lot of that is shifting because there are more queer and trans owned restaurants and establishments that exist. I still know so many queer and trans people who are in this industry who are still struggling to figure out what their path forward is. What does a sustainable path in food actually look like? And I think that that's an overarching issue in the culinary industry. I think in general, food is still really in the midst of this overhaul where, because culturally and pop culturally, people are starting to pay more attention to what goes on behind the scenes in restaurants. People are starting to pay more attention and ask more questions about what labor in a restaurant actually looks like and the abuses that are suffered. And so what happens is, yes, there's greater quote unquote representation, but we're not being intentional about who those representatives are and how they're actually aligning with the values that we want to see. We're more concerned with the aesthetic and the image than we are with the values. And that's something that food is still working on, and that food still has a very long way to go, I believe, because you can have things that look great on paper, but if those values aren't really present, then you're going to keep having this incessant turnover. You're going to keep having these labor abuses. You're going to keep bringing people into a restaurant who are then suffering at the hands of the powers that be.
Oh my gosh, I really, really appreciate everything that you just said. I think it just makes such a world of a difference to have the conversation on these terms and to be alive to those contradictions or those paradoxes of this moment. And even part of what you're saying, I just want to underline, I think it's really moving. On the one hand, every trans person I know has worked in the service industry, and often it's in food. There have been advantages historically to the same things that make that labor exploitative. Like, for example, I don't mean to say that this is even over, but like if your social security number doesn't have the same name that you go by, there are lots of reasons why you might want to work kind of off the books. But then that means that if something, really terrible is happening at work, or if you're just being illegally underpaid, you have no recourse. Because maybe actually appealing to a state labor board actually puts you at risk, not just to lose your job, but actually any interaction with the state, is already going to be a kind of presumptively criminalized one for you. And also, I'm kind of curious about your sense of this too. It does seem like some of the macroeconomic upheavals especially since 2020, like inflation and just like changes in the economy have like dramatically transformed all aspects of food. Like people cannot afford food. The food is too damn expensive at the grocery store. This is like a severe crisis level problem, not just in the United States, but certainly in the United States as well. It's also clearly completely transformed the restaurant industry, both in, the era of takeout omnipresence, of talk about gig work, delivery apps. But I'm also imagining in terms of the capital requirements for starting and owning a restaurant. So just, talking about queer and trans people on the service end, in the kitchen or in the front of house, in a kind of vulnerable, exploitative environment, there may be more queer, chefs in general now opening restaurants, but like opening a restaurant, I presume, is actually like getting harder just in terms of cost. And the restaurant industry was never like the most financially simple, or it was not a get rich quick scheme, right? Things have been changing, and not all of that is obvious, on the consumer end. I'm sort of curious, like, what's your sense of how things have shifted even just since 2020 in terms of like restaurants as an industry?
Something that's been beautiful that I've seen that has really turned the page since 2020 is there's been a lot more focus on pop-ups, because they are less cost intensive than running a brick and mortar. And there are a lot of pop-ups that I've seen that have since become brick and mortars because they've used that opportunity to build up their revenue, to build up their capital so that they can start up an actual brick and mortar restaurant. And that's been really exciting because the more queer restaurants that open, many of them also invite other queer chefs in to do pop-ups at their establishment. I was very fortunate that last summer I got to do a pop-up at Hags in the Lower East Side, which is one of the most exceptional restaurants, I believe, in the Lower East Side. They're really doing some incredible things. And it was so special to me as a freelancer, as a gig worker, to be able to go in there and have a day where I got to live my childhood fantasy of, running a restaurant for a day. Like, I got to really have that sort of breath to explore and to play in that way. And so while there are all of these barriers and all of these struggles, queer people inherently are going to come together and find solutions and ways to uplift each other and ways to support each other through those hurdles. And I think that that's part of the reason we're seeing queer food have such a moment, is because while there are so many other aspects of the food industry that continue to become challenging and more challenging, like we said, there's something to the queer resilience and the resilience of our community and coming together and platforming each other and championing each other and celebrating each other that is allowing us to kind of weather those storms maybe a little better or a little differently, I'll say, than our non-queer counterparts.
Well, it seems like one of the ways that you're really involved in a lot of that, too, is pop-ups, community dinners. I mean, there are these other modalities that you have been spending some of your time helping put on and being a part of. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Like, what are those like? You were just talking about sort of one example, but kind of curious for those of us who haven't had the pleasure to sit at that table yet. Can you kind of paint the scene?
Writing about food made me miss cooking it. and specifically made me miss cooking it for people. And so for me, a lot of my cooking is very deeply rooted in the African diaspora. My mom is Black American, my dad's from Congo. And so finding the sort of intersections between those cuisines are a lot of the places where I start from, and then building out just to the broader diaspora, looking at other parts of Africa, looking at the Caribbean, looking at even Afro-Latino cooking, and seeing just what stories I can tell through these dishes and how I can invite people in to really experience them. Because for me, food as a storytelling medium is something that I really appreciate, because you can have never been to a place, never tried anything from that country, not even speak the language. But if you try a dish from somewhere, you have kind of this somatic understanding of place and of time and of culture. And that's something that's so beautiful to me. And that was always the way that I explored the world as a kid, was through the ways that I ate. I grew up in Maryland, right outside DC, in a very international community. And so being able to try foods from around the world really broadened my worldview in this way that otherwise I probably wouldn't have experienced. And so when I pull together and experience a dinner experience, it's really to shift perspective, to shift worldview, to get people kind of thinking maybe deeper and maybe in a way that they wouldn't have initially about the things that they're eating. So one of my favorite dishes that I did at a recent pop-up for Black History Month was a fried oyster dish that was kind of my take on one of my favorite Japanese dishes, which is agedashi tofu. So lightly fried tofu with dashi, like one of my favorite dishes in the world. I love it. The crispiness with the sauciness, the textures. It's fabulous. So I was like, okay, if I wanted to play on, the textures of this, but rooted in my own experience and in my diaspora, what would that look like? So I thought about fried oysters because my grandpa's from Arkansas. Fried oysters are huge in like Southern, culture. And oysters have a very long standing Black history as well. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to take an oyster. I'm going to tempura fry it. But what is the dashi that I'm going to serve it in? I decided to do a smoked fish pot liquor. And pot liquor is something that has this incredibly rich history in the South, being that liquor that you get, that liquid that you get from making collard greens. And in Central Africa, when we make greens, we don't use ham hocks like we do in the US. We use smoked fish. And so I was like, how can I pull all of these threads? So I used smoked herring to make the pot liquor. I served it in the half shell with the fried oyster so that people also had the heuristic of, shooting an oyster from the shell itself. That one dish took about 7 hours of labor. But it was a labor of love, truly, because I was thinking so intentionally about all of just the cultural elements that could come in here. And I was thinking, how can I respect both the origins of the dish, which is, taking that inspiration from agedashi tofu and the history of dashi. And I was like, what is as historied as dashi in my culture? Pot liquor. And so when I create a culinary experience, it's really about weaving that web and making all of these connections between culture through food as the medium and as the lens.
Wow, that's thrilling. Maybe as we move towards the end of our conversation, I mean, part of what you were just, I think, really helping us sink into is a kind of interesting countercurrent. I've certainly observed the way that food culture has kind of been packaged up and around the concept of authenticity to confer value. I mean, that has a sort of, I think, clumsy or just like market relationship to culture, which is often a synecdoche for race and for difference. And I'm just thinking, for example, like the rise of street food as cooler than haute cuisine, and the way that like now, when you travel, you're supposed to really try. Yeah, right. Go to the city core, go to the real food, right? Or just that there are like fancy food halls in a lot of gentrified neighborhoods in America that ostensibly serve street food. And that's like a real shift in taste. But it's like, it's communicating so much. And what strikes me about everything that you've been talking about is you've been describing dishes, dining opportunities, community events where the authenticity seems like it's kind of been thrown out the window in a certain way, not just in a kind of fusion way, but like you're just talking about playing instead of like, trying to prove the authenticity and the core and the truth. And I guess just sort of as a final note, right? It's like, okay, queer is not a national or ethnic signifier, although in some ways it obscures the fact that it comes, primarily from white people, the global north. But like, is that part of just sort of the attitude or the disposition that you want to hold from queer food? Kind of like giving us some more license to play in a moment where there's a lot of pressure to prove authenticity and to package up an experience that someone can digest, pardon the pun, because it just seems to me like you're suggesting a different kind of sensory experience that's actually a way to talk about things a little bit more complexly. I don't know. Does that land for you at all?
No, absolutely. Because when I think about queer food, when I think about queer anything, I always go back to my foundational understanding of the word queer as a verb and how we are queering things, how we are taking things and viewing them from a different perspective, how we are shifting things in order to break down boundaries and break down barriers and be able to create space for everyone to exist autonomously and in a way that is self-determined. And so in viewing food through that lens, for me, that means giving people the room to play more and to express, like you said, authenticity, quote unquote, but what that means for them as an individual, as opposed to trying to fall into what a marketably authentic Mexican experience or a marketably authentic Korean experience or, a quote unquote authentic Haitian experience might look like. And instead thinking, what does that experience look like for me as a human being and how I've lived through my culture, how I've experienced my life, and how do I communicate that authentically and that in a way that represents me? And those are really the opportunities and the restaurants and the experiences that excite me the most, because what it is I can tell that the chef is putting themselves and putting their heart and putting everything that they have on that plate. And I think that that's something that can be applied to any chef, queer, straight, what have you. The chefs who I love talking to are the ones who are really constantly thinking about how they can not necessarily completely rewrite the script and change the entire industry, but how they can just make an inch, a little more space for themselves and a little more wiggle room so that people who are also of their experience can kind of follow suit. And I see that a lot, especially with queer restaurateurs, but it really is, more than anything, it's a paradigm shift, I think, away from sort of the old traditional staunchy rhetoric of food and how so much of the culinary industry, especially in this country in America, is determined from the European, French, and British culinary systems, and how the French brigade system was completely based on the French Navy. And so if we want to talk about queering food and queerness in food, we also need to examine how the way that kitchens are traditionally set up was based off of French militarism and have that conversation as well. And if we're constantly talking about queerness and fighting against, certain oppressive structures, we need to also recognize where these structures are rooted. And so any chef who is dedicated to really getting to those roots and to really picking these things apart is someone who I'm paying attention to, because really there are so many broader ways in which we can really engage with food, interact with food, that can be intentional, can be elevated, can be, experiential without having to be too stuffy and too exclusionary, and without having to also put others down, because that was also so much of how American food was defined, was by shunting cultural foods and shunting foods from, African, Asian, Latin diasporas out of the main picture. Every single brown kid I know has a lunchbox trauma story. They brought a lunch to school and some kid was like, that smells weird. That looks weird. What are you eating? Why don't you just have pizza and chicken nuggets like the rest of us? And now those same kids who were saying that are like, yeah, I just got a reservation at this at this omakase restaurant for next weekend. It's those same kids. And so it's so interesting how when we have these conversations of authenticity, so much of it for me, I think needs to be personally driven, because there is no one way to exist in any culture. There is no one way to exist in any ethnicity, nationality, what have you. But there is only one way for each individual to exist. And that's what makes each place unique.
Absolutely fascinating and invigorating. So much to chew on. Well, I'm being self-conscious about my puns now. This has been so fascinating. I think that, your journalism and your storytelling and also the food that you are serving, all things to look out for and follow along. But thank you so much for being our guide to queer food and to some bigger things for us to be thinking about as we sit down at the table this summer and going forward.
Thank you so much for having me. Truly just a pleasure to get to nerd out with a fellow childhood Food Network stan.
Long live the original Iron Chef, yes.
Yes.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode. But before we go, please do send us your feedback and topic ideas to outwardpodcast@slate.com. Or if you want to reach out on Facebook or X, we are at Slate Outward. Just a reminder, if you join Slate Plus, you'll get ad-free podcasts, extra segments on shows like Working, and never hit a paywall on the Slate site. To learn more about that, you can go to slate.com/outwardplus. Our show was produced in very good taste by the one and only Palace Shaw. If you like Outward, please do subscribe in your podcast app, tell your friends about it, and rate and review the show so other people can find it. And in the meantime, stay gay. Bye-bye.
It is Ryan here, and I have a question for you. What do you do when you win? Like, are you a fist pumper, a woohooer, a hand clapper, a high fiver? I kind of like the high five, but if you want to hone in on those winning moves, check out Chumba Casino. At ChumbaCasino.com, choose from hundreds of social casino-style games for your chance to redeem serious cash prizes. There are new game releases weekly, plus free daily bonuses. So don't wait. Start having the most fun ever at ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.